Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Shorty September. Terrific BookTube event that really allows you to clear off some of the stuff on your shelves, pull down some of those short books, fewer than 200 pages, fewer than 100 pages, pull down some of those short books and cross them off the list. Enjoy them, but don't spend all week on them. That's what Shorty September highlights, real short books. And I've been having a blast. I intend to do a video for Shorty September every day. It's no trouble at all to toss one of these short things onto the night's reading. And last time, we looked at One Writer's Beginnings by Eudora Welty, which is a book that, when I was discussing it, I said that I'd read it more times than I could remember. This is true. There are quite a few short books for Shorty September that I've read more times than I can remember. A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf comes immediately to mind, but also Cal by McClaverley comes to mind. A bunch of other things, too. A bunch of short books that I have read many, 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 many times. And so I thought, when I was contemplating last night's Shorty September, that I would move away from that I would go to some little book that I haven't read a million times. Actually, I don't really know how many times I've read A Night to Remember either. But what happened instead? Instead, I went to a book that if I can look at something like One Writer's Beginnings or A Night to Remember and say, I have read that more times than I can count, well, then what am I supposed to say about the book I read last night? The shorty book I read last night, 120 pages. The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle. I have no idea, none whatsoever, how many times I have read this book. I have read it out loud to you on this channel. I have done buddy reads of it more than once. I have recommended it over and over and over again, and yet there is no explanation for why, there's no justification imaginable for why I would ever read this again, much less for Shorty September, but I did. I read it again. Doyle wrote this in 1902, 1903, something like that. It's set in the late 1880s. And he did it as a kind of cheat, because he had already written and published a story called The Final Solution, The Final Problem, where Sherlock Holmes grapples with Professor Moriarty on a ledge over the Reichenbach Falls, and they both fall to their death. Where Doyle kills off Sherlock Holmes, his own immortal character. Very few writers get to write an immortal character. Very few of them do. And Doyle knew already, he knew in his lifetime that he had written such a thing, and he decided to kill that character. And he had no real qualms about it. He was pestered with letters and apocryphally by pelted fruit in the street, but he had no real qualms about having killed off Holmes. But there was a lot of call for more Holmes, and also there was money on the table. So he decided, well, I've killed off the character, but I made it clear in the body of stories that I wrote that he had plenty of adventures that John Watson did not chronicle. What if I were to give the public one of those? An earlier story. So Holmes would be appearing in print again, but I would not be violating the continuity of The Final Problem. So he did that. He wrote a story called The Hound of the Baskervilles that is, I would argue, one of the most beloved and most reprinted works of fiction anywhere in human history. God only knows how many times this story has been reprinted. God only knows how many editions there have been, in how many languages, and how many adaptations on screen, on stage, everything. The reason for that is that it's a humdinger of a story. And it will be familiar to you. I'm assuming that most of you have read this, but then again, Shorty September often catches people a little bit by surprise as they suddenly realize, oh wait, that short work that I have on my shelf, I haven't actually ever read that. Well, now's your chance. This is a story in which a humble country doctor comes to Holmes and Watson with a problem. Old Sir Henry Baskerville has died at Baskerville Hall out in Devon on the Dartmoor, on the moors in Devon, the misty wastelands, the upper tablelands of the moors, and Sir Baskerville had a heart condition, and it doesn't seem all that confusing, except that by his dead body, whose face is in a rictus of pure terror, are the footprints of a giant hound. And the family is bedeviled by a narrative that I thought I would read you for Shorty September. They are bedeviled by a supernatural narrative about the Hound, dating from centuries before. The Hound that has stalked the Baskerville family. This is the old account that Holmes reads from the doctor who comes to see him, Dr. Mortimer. Of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles, there have been many statements. Yet as I came in a direct line from Hugo Baskerville, and as I had the story from my father, who had it also from his, I have set it down with all belief that it occurred even as it is here set forth. And I would have you believe, my sons, that the same justice which punishes sin must also graciously forgive it, and that no ban is so heavy but that by prayer and repentance it may be removed. Always a Baskerville is going to hope for that, because they're a family of right royal bastards. Learn then from this story not to fear the fruits of the past, but rather to be circumspect in the future, that those foul passions whereby our family has suffered so grievously may not again be loosed to our undoing. Know then that in the time of the Great Rebellion, the history of which I learned from Lord Clarendon, I must earnestly commend to your attention, and here I recommend that as well. We have Clarendon's history, and it is really good reading. This manor of Baskerville was held by Hugo of that name, nor can it be gainsaid that he was a most wild, profane, and godless man. This, in truth, his neighbours might have pardoned, seeing that saints have never flourished in these parts, but there was in him a certain wanton and cruel humour which made his name a byword throughout the West. It chanced that this Hugo came to love, if indeed so dark a passion may be known under so bright a name. It isn't love, it's lust. The daughter of a yeoman who held lands near the Baskerville estate. But the young maiden, being discreet and of good repute, would ever avoid him, for she feared his evil name. So it came to pass one Michaelmas that Hugo, with 5 or 6 of his idle and wicked companions, stole down from the farm and carried off the maiden, her father and brothers being far from home, as he well knew. When they had brought her to the hall, the maiden was placed in an upper chamber, while Hugo and his friends sat down to a long carouse, as was their nightly custom. Now the poor lass upstairs was like to have had her wits turned at the singing and shouting and terrible oaths which came up to her from below, for they say that the words used by Hugo Baskerville when he was in wine were as such as might blast a man who said them. At last the stress of her fear did which might have daunted the bravest and most active man, for by the aid of the growth of ivy which covers, and still covers, the south wall, she came down from under the eaves, and so homeward across the moor, there being 3 leagues betwixt the hall and her father's farm. Shod just for the household, no weapons, no implements, no light, she makes her way across the moor. It chanced that some little time later Hugo left his guest to carry food and drink, and other worse things, perchance, to his captive, and so found the cage empty, and the bird escaped. Then it would seem he became as one that hath a devil, for rushing down the stairs into the dining hall, he sprang upon the great table, flagons and trenchers flying before him, and he cried aloud before all the company that he would that very night render his body and soul to the powers of evil, if he would but overtake the wench. And while the revellers stood aghast at the fury of the man, one more wicked, or it may be more drunken than the rest, cried out that they should put the hounds upon her, that they should loose his hunting hounds on a human. Whereat Hugo ran from the house, crying to his grooms that they should saddle his mare and unkennel the pack, and giving the hounds a kerchief of the maid's, he swung them to the line, so off in full cry in the moonlight over the moor. Now for some space the revellers stood agape, unable to understand all that had been done in such haste. But anon their bemused wits awoke to the nature of the deed which was like to be done upon the moorlands. Everything was now in an uproar, some calling for their pistols, some for their horses, some for another flask of wine. But at length some sense came back to their crazed minds, and the whole of them, 13 in number, took horse and started in pursuit, presumably to stop Sir Hugo. The moon shone clear above them, and they rode swiftly abreast, taking that course which the maid must needs have taken if she were to reach her own home. They had gone but a mile or two when they passed one of the night shepherds upon the moorlands, and they cried to him to know if he had seen the hunt. The man, as the story goes, was so crazed with fear that he could scarce speak, but at last he said that he had indeed seen the unhappy maiden with the hounds upon her track. "But I've seen more than that," said he, For Hugo Baskerville passed me upon his black mare, and there ran mute behind him such a hound of hell as God forbid should ever be at my heels. So the drunken squires cursed the shepherd and rode on. But soon their skins turned cold, for there came a sound of galloping across the moor, and the black mare, dabbled with white froth, went past with trailing bridle and empty saddle. Then the revellers rode close together, and for a great fear was on them. But they still followed over the moor, though each, had he been alone, would have been right glad to have turned his horse's head. Riding slowly in this fashion, they came at last upon the hounds. These, though known for their valor and their breed, were whimpering in a cluster at the head of a deep dip, or goyal, as we call it, upon the moor. Some slinking away, and some, with starting hackles and staring eyes, gazing down the narrow valley before them. The company had come to a halt, more sober men, as you may guess, than when they started. The most of them would by no means advance, but 3 of them, the boldest, or it may be the most drunken, rode forward now down the goyal. Now it opened into a broad space in which 2 of those great stones, still to be seen there, which were set by certain forgotten peoples in the days of old. The moon was shining bright upon the clearing, and there in the center lay the unhappy maid as she had fallen, dead of fear or fatigue. But it was not the sight of her body, nor yet that of the body of Sir Hugo Baskerville lying next to her, which raised the hair upon the heads of these 3 devil roisterers. It was, standing over Hugo, and plucking at his throat, there stood a foul thing, a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that any mortal eye had ever rested upon. And even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville, on which, as it turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws on them, the 3 shrieked with fear, and rode for dear life, still screaming, across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night of what he has seen, and the other twain were but broken men for the rest of their days. Such is my tale, my sons, of the coming of the Hound, which is said to have plagued the family so sorely ever since. If I have set it down because that which is clearly known hath less terror than that which but hinted at or guessed. Nor can it be denied that many of the family have been unhappy in their deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious. Yet we may shelter ourselves in the infinite goodness of Providence, which would not forever punish the innocent beyond that 3rd or 4th generation which is threatened in Holy Writ. To that Providence, my sons, I hereby commend you, and I counsel you, by way of caution, to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted. That Holmes here sees that document and assumes that this is just local folklore, but there are footprints of a giant hound near the dead Sir Baskerville. And there's an heir who has been in America and comes to England and is immediately set upon with mysteries. Holmes begins to think there's something clearly afoot, but he doesn't go to Devon himself. He sends Watson. The bulk of the first part of this book is Watson in Devon, meeting the Baskervilles, meeting their neighbors, getting to know the lay of the land, and sending off letters to Holmes, who is in London. But the story gradually builds, and there are all kinds of things in it. In addition to the dog, there is an escaped murderer on the moor. No one knows where he is. No one knows where to find him. No one knows who's giving him shelter. There's a mysterious housekeeper and his wife at Baskerville Hall who seem to have an agenda of their own. And on top of that, there's the topography of the moor itself, which is so beautifully evoked in this book that by the end, it actually has a starring part in the action. There is a moment that is beautifully drawn that has nothing to do with supernatural hounds or villains or murderers or anything. It's just the weather. At one point at the climax of the book, our heroes are compelled to wait for the weather on the moor. And it's amazing. The whole thing is amazing. I know it has its detractors, including a rather famous book that posited that the solution is bunkum. That the solution that he's come to at the end of the book is bunkum. That it could easily have been something else. And that Conan Doyle did not really put together this book very well. Well, you can say that all you want. But there is only, I would guess, 5, maybe 6 more popular books of any kind, in any language, anywhere in the world. So I think The Hound of the Baskervilles has the last laugh in terms of its shoddy construction. And that, believe it or not, was my Shorty September. no excuse whatsoever to read this book again, but I did. I started it, and then I was lost. So I'm going to try to talk about something a little less familiar tomorrow. I'll see. We'll see what I put on the pile for tonight. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.